The Marinade.
There's no O in Marinade. Let's try it one more time. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
The Marinade.
Marinade.
Bone marinade.
That's
The Marinade.
The Marinade. With Jason Earle.
I was born in winter, maybe it was fall. Heard this story many times, I don't remember it at all. Tonight the wind's sharp as a razor, and the sky looks like a broom. I'm stranded in Los Feliz, trembling with the Lithium Blues.
Welcome to The Marinade with Jason Earle, a free-flowing conversation about the creative process with creative people. This is episode 40, and our guest is Chad Cochran, better known as Cowtown Chad. Chad's a photographer and artist based in Cleveland, Ohio. If you regularly listen to this show, then you are likely familiar with his work. Chad has photographed our friends Sarah Shook, BJ Barham, Jim Lauderdale, Erica Blinn, Kasey Anderson, and so many more, not to mention his incredible concert photography work. His latest project is I Didn't Want to Tell You. It's a photo essay, a portrait series, the objective of which is to further the necessary conversation around mental health. Mental health is a huge topic on this show for very personal reasons. Depression, anxiety, and the addiction that often comes with them run throughout my family. And they and their brethren also wreak havoc among artists of all types. Thus, this is a huge honor for me. I've long had admiration for Chad's work. To talk with him about a project of such importance is really quite a thrill. This one's a phone interview, y'all. We normally release these as website-exclusive episodes, but I made an exception in this case because I think the conversation around mental health is an essential one, and Chad and I went really deep. And I think Chad's project needs to be consumed as broadly as possible. So whatever we can do to spread the word, I wanted to make sure I did it on as broad a scale as possible. You can find Chad Cochran's piece, I Didn't Want to Tell You, in the fall wellness issue of No Depression magazine, which can be ordered at nodepression.com. And you can find more of Chad's work at cowtownchad.com. The song you're hearing in this episode is Lithium Blues by Hawks and Doves off the album From a White Hotel. It's provided courtesy of our good friend Kasey Anderson. I just thought that it provided a really ideal soundtrack for this particular conversation around mental health. Everyone, my conversation with Chad Cochran.
I had ice water in my veins and storm clouds rage around my skull. Now my hands, they won't stay steady and my senses have been dull. If you'd only asked me, I'd have told you everything I know. I ain't talking now, I'm just walking with the Lithium Blues.
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I got you. Hey,
okay,
Chad.
Perfect. How's it going?
I'm good, man. Thank you so much for doing this. I am really
I
looking
really
forward to
appreciate it.
talking
Thank
with
you.
Yeah. So, man, I am such a fan of your work. To start off, I'm just a fan of your photography. I love following you on social media and seeing the gorgeous things you put together. And then this project, I Didn't Want to Tell You, normalizing the conversation around mental health, is one that, for us in the Marinade, and for me personally, really speaks to me and speaks to the spirit of this show. We talk about mental health. Almost every episode. I mean, and in fact, I've had, for example, Sarah Shook on our show, and a huge part of what we discussed is mental health how to deal with it, how to get where you need to be. So thank you for this project, and thank you for all the amazing work that you do.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that.
So can you tell me how this all came about? As I read sort of the intro to this project, it's been in the works for a long time, all the way back to a specific moment in a hotel room that you recall. Can you kind of walk us through what that moment was like and how this whole thing has evolved?
Yeah. So, if nobody knows, so I started my photography career really as a rural photographer. Did a lot of I always call it the dark side of Ohio. A lot of focused on, rural landscapes, barns, old farmhouses, those, that type of decay. And I I actually had a few people reach out to me, Lydia Lovelace actually being one of them, years ago, and said something along the lines of, you take really pretty pictures of Ohio. Would you ever have any interest in putting a person in those photos? And at the time, doing that rural photography was kind of my mental health break. So I had a pretty demanding 9-to-5 job. And so what I did, to kind of get away from that is I would, put on the music, I would take my camera with me, and I would go on back roads. And it was kind of my escape. It was for an hour, 2, 3, whatever I could get away with. That's what I would do. So when she reached out to me, I think my initial response back to her was no. Because that really wasn't, I was like, it's not really what I do.
That's my thing.
It's not my thing. Yeah. So not only, having the preconceived notion that I'm probably not going to be very good at it, it's also, kind of cuts into, my getaway. That's not really my thing. I always kind of joked and said, I spend most of my days interacting with people all day long. It was my one opportunity to not have to do that. Yeah. And if I remember correctly, I think she probably replied back and said, are you fucking kidding me? Would probably be my guess. And so I reconsidered, and I was like, all right, let's do this. And so I did some photos of her, and prior to that, I'd taken some photos of BJ from American Aquarium, and they were just okay. I just wasn't very good at it. I didn't really know much about it. And it really wasn't until another podcaster, Sloan Spencer, that does Country Fried Rock, several years ago, Sloan invited me down to do a schoolhouse show. She was doing a kind of like a house concert, but it was going to be at a old one-room schoolhouse. And I'm also an artist, so she's like, why don't you bring your art down? You can show your art. And Caleb Cottle is going to be the musician. And I was like, oh, I'm actually a big fan of Caleb. That'll be pretty cool. And so when I got down there, probably like a week before, Caleb had reached out and said, hey, would you like to do photos? And I said, yeah, I'd love to do that. And I like telling this story because it kind of sets the moment for me being very late in my career. I didn't get a camera until I was about 40 years old. And I'm there with Caleb, and I'm trying to make small talk, and I say something along the lines of, who's your manager? And at the time, his manager was a guy named Andy Tennille. And he goes, do you know Andy? And I go, well, his name sounds really familiar to me, but I certainly don't know him personally. I go, should I? And he's like, well, he's Tom Petty's tour photographer. And so it was that moment that I was like, oh my God, what am I doing here? Why would you ask me to take photos of you if you have Andy available to you? And so it was one of those moments where it was like my scared straight moment. I'm like, oh my God, I need to figure this out. Like, people are starting to trust me to take their photos, and I really need to know what I'm doing. So coincidentally, those photos turned out great. They were published a bunch, and Caleb and I, we remain friends today. So that's like that's a long-winded intro. But what ended up happening is I didn't know Americana Fest existed. I had no idea that it was a festival. And so it was probably I know I had this documented somewhere. I just don't have it in front of me. So it was probably like 2014 or 15. I heard about the festival, and my wife was like, "Oh, well, you should just go to it." And I'm like, "Well, it's like tomorrow in Nashville." And I was living in Ohio, and she's like, yeah, you should just go. We'll figure it out. She's like, just go get a hotel room and figure it out. Wow. And so I went to all of the, non-wristband events. And so as I had started, doing photos with musicians, what I had started to notice is that a lot of their stories had many parallels. Like, some of them had some traumatic stuff happen to them when they were younger. Some of them had battled drug addiction. Some of them had battled alcoholism, and other things along those lines. And at the same time, I was also dealing with my father. My father, who in the mid-'80s had a couple back surgeries while I was in high school and got addicted to opioids, which turned out to be an ongoing situation that I dealt with for the remainder of my adult life until he passed away a few years ago. And what I really started to notice is that these stories existed, but you weren't really hearing them. And at the time, we fortunately today, it's becoming a lot more accepted and maybe a lot more common. I guess maybe a lot more open is probably a better way to say it, right, where people are starting to talk about mental health a little bit more and bringing it out into the forefront. But there was a long time when it was taboo, and still for a lot of people it's taboo. But when I was having these sometimes 1 hour with somebody, sometimes 10 minutes with somebody, sometimes 6 hours with somebody doing photos, there were so many of their stories that were similar. And since I was also battling with some stuff of my own with my father, I had decided that, hey, what would be a really cool idea is if I could somehow get these people to talk and make it like an art show that I would do. That was the initial idea. Is I would do a portrait, and then they would tell me a story that they either had never told anybody or a story that maybe they'd only told a small circle. And that went nowhere. And I pitched it to, absolutely nowhere. I pitched it to magazines. I pitched it to online publications, and it just didn't do anything. And like some of the, I'd become friends with quite a few musicians, and some of them had taken the approach that, they're pretty private. And I was like, man, I'm just doing this all wrong. Like, it felt like such a good idea. And about a year ago, I changed the way that I phrased the question. And instead of, making it sound so secretive, I tried to phrase it in such a way that it opened up the possibilities for the answers. And it let the subject or my friends, sometimes both, would then have the opportunity to kind of tell the story as they want. And the way that I changed it is I said, how has mental health played a role in your life? And that changed everything, because it lets people talk about personal experiences or maybe something they dealt with a parent or an aunt or uncle or relative or friend. Yeah. And it really has changed the dynamics of the project for sure.
Was that just from you workshopping, all right, what do I do next? Or were you soliciting like opinions from maybe journalists or people about how to phrase it? How did that shift happen other than the clear, the lack of success with the other approach?
It truly was a fail upon fail upon fail upon fail until one day, like that thought went through my head, and I was like, oh, well, what if I try this? And it just happened to work. Right. So I very bullheadedly did not consult with anybody, did not talk to any of my journalist friends, but I do have. And, I kind of, yeah, and it was basically like, I'm just going to keep running into this wall until it finally cracks. And luckily, that at least that thought after several years popped into my head. Yeah. And then after that happened, everything kind of changed.
Oh, wow.
It really, more people were interested in the project. At the time, I didn't really have any place to share it, but I knew I had a better handle on the concept and the project.
Right. Are you just geared that way to run yourself into the wall repeatedly, or is that something you developed over time? Like, how did you persevere? Was it like, how did you not give up? You know what I mean? Because eventually, a lot of times, even if it's the best idea, a lot of folks give up on those things. What allows you to persevere there and keep pushing?
So I think what helps is that I tend to have a lot of sticks in the fire, or whatever the appropriate phraseology is for that. But so I always have a lot of stuff going on. I don't sit very well, so I'm always trying to come up with another project. So from the time that from that concept of this series 5 years ago, or whatever it was, or 4 or 5 years ago, whatever it was now, I probably had done 30 art shows in that amount of time, and I'd probably shot, who knows how many, 100 or so concerts in that amount of time. So I didn't lack a creative outlet. I didn't lack, any opportunity to have my brain working and keep myself moving forward. But I always kept coming back to that project. And, there was a handful of people that I had confided in about the project, and they were kind of like me. They're like, this is going to work. Like, this is a great concept. It's going to work. But nobody came to me with like that light, that proverbial light bulb over their head and said, I've got an idea.
Yeah.
Instead it was like, that's a really good idea. I don't get it either. And then, finally it I kind of cracked the code, I guess. And here we are.
That's great, man. And when so now it is published in No Depression. So was there a pitch there that finally got through? Was there a moment where you finally went, okay, shit, we're doing this?
Yeah. So I mean, here's the thing. People can bash on social media as much as they like, and I have fallen victim to that as well. Periodically, I will go down the rabbit hole and on both Facebook and Twitter, and so I usually try to do my best to stay afloat. Mm-hmm. But I actually had somebody had that I knew had mentioned that they were going to meet somebody from No Depression for dinner. And I was like, oh, well, that would be just one of those like mutual friends. He and I don't know each other personally, but we are friends on Facebook. And he goes, maybe I'll say something to him, about the article, because I'd said that I had this series that I was working on. And he ended up talking to, hopefully I get this name right, I believe it's Adam Kerr, who's a marketing guy for No Depression. And they said they talked about it, and they ended up, I got Adam's contact information and sent him a note. And first of all, Scott Vieth was the guy, so I want to make sure I say thank you to Scott. The guy runs an awesome house concert series, I believe out of the Baltimore area, and is incredibly kind and generous to musicians. So kudos to him, and thank you again to him. But he made the connection to Adam, and Adam goes, I think this is a really good idea. I'm going to connect you with Hillary. And I believe Hillary is the editor for No Depression, or at least the senior editor, and put me together. And she and I spoke, and she's like, oh yeah. She's like, coincidentally, we're doing a wellness issue this fall. I think this will work perfectly. Awesome. And so, it was one of those things where, I did I run into the wall over and over and over? Yes. Conceptually, the series changed just a little bit, and there's no doubt that with the help of friends and truly with the help of timing, this came to light.
Yeah.
So I feel very, very fortunate that things lined up the way they did, and that it's out there now.
Well, I mean, speaking of BJ Barham, he just released a video of him playing one of his new tunes from the forthcoming record, where he said, I think the the chorus says, the harder you work, the luckier you get. So that sounds to me like a perfect example where you were chipping away at this idea. You knew it was a good idea, but the things start to line up when they're supposed to line up. I don't know if you believe in that kind of thing or not, but I have noticed that the more I'm chipping away at an idea, the better it gets. And then when everything else starts to line up after I've kind of done the mucking and the banging my head against the wall.
Yeah, I think it's like if you're a writer, right? Like, so if you're a writer or a musician, very few people just knock a song out in 3 minutes. You hear those outliers and the fun stories about people that make hits and it took them 10 minutes to write it.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people that it's truly a craft. And I think it's kind of, that can be applied to several different parts of your life. And for me, it's always been the hustle. So I like to hustle. I like to get out there and do stuff. I like to shoot shows and talk to people and do that. But I also think that there's a timing component to it. And this was just one of those moments where the hustle was absolutely necessary, to build that body of relationships that I now have in the music community. But it was also, it could not have been a year ago, maybe this didn't make any sense to No Depression. And periodically, or not periodically, but coincidentally, right now, it made perfect sense.
Right. That's wonderful. The medium of portrait, does that enhance people's ability to open up when you're having that, say, 1 hour session with them? Or is it more difficult to pull things out since you are taking a photo of someone that it feels like could be a very intimate thing, and then they're giving away a lot of themselves already, it seems like?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a great question. And I've taken a little bit of a different approach with this because what I didn't want to do was put people in a position where I said, hey, come to my studio, or some of these people even were at my house, where I said, hey, let me take a photo of you and then tell me a really deep story about mental health, and how it affected your life.
Yeah.
I wasn't really sure that was probably the right approach. So the way I've been doing it is, I've really gotten into portrait photography more over the last couple of years. And I've certainly gotten better at it. I wouldn't say that I'm great at it, but I feel like I'm on the right track and I'm learning. And what I have found to be, or at least what I have found to work for this series, is that I do these portraits and then I go back to the person after I've done the portraits. And I say, hey, I'm working on this series. This is the premise. If you'd like to participate, I would love for that to happen. Certainly no obligation. And I am sending those messages and emails out daily. I sent probably 5 out yesterday. I sent 3 more out today. And it's kind of just people who are now in my portfolio that I've done photos with, who I've said, hey, I probably mentioned this when we were doing photos, but now I'm following up. If you'd love to participate, that would be great. And a lot of people have been fantastic about it and are very eager to participate. There are those who have chosen not to, and I fully support their decision to do that. And then there's a handful that are kind of pumping the brakes, or kind of getting a feel for what they want to do. And I wouldn't say they're non-committal; they're just not quite ready yet. And I appreciate that and can fully understand that those conversations should only happen when you're ready to have them.
Of course. Yeah. And especially those public conversations like that. I mean, to put it out there is a lot. And I think it's interesting how musicians, artists of all types, right? But musicians specifically are putting themselves out there, emotionally putting themselves out there and making themselves vulnerable on an almost nightly basis. But you still have to maintain a little bit of yourself. And so it is interesting how musicians are able to balance that in their personal lives, sometimes not so great, sometimes really well, but also their public persona, because the public is kind of expecting, their fans at least are expecting them to contribute something emotionally in a certain way?
Yeah, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but we'll go back to social media, and I'm 47 years old now. I'll be 48 in December, and I grew up like a total metalhead. I don't ever shy away from that. I mean, that's truly kind of how I grew up, and still am for the most part. And I think of kind of what it was like growing up, and how the connections you had to artists and musicians. I mean, MTV was highly influential. I mean, that's how you got to see what somebody looked like, or maybe you picked up Hit Parade or Rolling Stone or Billboard, or something like that, where you could visually see, or Teen Beat, or whatever it was, that was out there, that let you visually see what these people look like. But social media has changed that paradigm. It really has changed, like, where the artists, so much has changed. So the artists have become closer to their fans. I think they're able to communicate more freely with their fans if they choose to do so. Right. But the music industry has changed also, right? I mean, so it's not the old days where you got a big, a nice contract and you could live well off of that. People are out there. Music probably makes up a pretty small percentage, unless you're a huge artist, of what folks are able to make. A lot of it is through kind of like building those relationships, and people buying merchandise and touring. And so it's incredibly important to keep those connections. But I think you're right, back to what you said, it's also a balancing act. And how do you do that? How do you put yourself out there so much? I think mental health has to play a role in that, where you really need some time off. Like, I've got tons of friends that are out there touring, 150, 200 days a year, some more. And, usually when they're home, they're home. They don't try to, they try not to do too much else. They try to just be a human being and, be with their kids or their family and do those types of things, which I think is absolutely necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. Thinking about the sustainability of normalizing the conversation, and thinking about sort of what something you said earlier, the story about your dad kind of made me think about how, especially I'm 38, so growing up in as a kid in the 80s and 90s, I definitely, and where I did in a small town in Florida, I definitely did not feel like the sort of broader conversation about mental health was normal. In my family, we did talk about it a lot, and I'm fortunate because I remember my father's an alcoholic, and I remember my parents sitting me down when I was like at the precipice of adolescence, and them wanting to get out ahead of it, and knowing that, hey, we've got addicts throughout our family. We need to make sure he understands that there's a good chance he's predisposed to addiction, and he needs to be aware of that before it becomes a temptation. And now I know that in hindsight, but I remember my response to my parents was, when they said that my father is an alcoholic, I did not remember ever seeing my dad have a drink. I was too young when he quit to remember it. And I remember them saying that he's an alcoholic, and my reaction being, well, that can't be true. Alcoholics are bad people, and Dad's not a bad person. Like, that was what my 6th grade brain or whatever it was processed, because that's wherever I was getting those messages from. That's how I was interpreting those messages. And thankfully, we were able to talk about it as a family. But if I didn't have that core there, then I would not have had that more normalized idea of mental health and the ability now. I mean, who knows what would have happened in the intermittent years, but like now I feel very comfortable. I talk about it on this show almost every time. I talk about it with friends and family very openly about my own anxieties and bouts of depression and all of that kind of thing, very openly. But there wasn't a broader community conversation about that. And I wonder if you have thoughts about, like, how do we take something like this project that you've embarked on and make kind of bigger waves?
Yeah, so I've got a long-winded answer, and the first thing I'll kind of relate to is the not knowing or not understanding. And I can tell you that when I found out my dad was a drug addict, I can remember my stepmother having that conversation with me. We were not a family that did talk a lot about any of that stuff. I would say that we probably avoided those conversations at all costs. Not intentionally. It just really wasn't something that we ever talked about. We didn't have that kind of an openness, I would say, to conversations growing up, at least to deal with those kind of topics. Yeah. And I came home, memory serves me right, I think I came home like maybe from college, maybe my sophomore year or something like that. And she let me know, about my dad. And I can remember just being so incredibly confused, thinking, a drug addict? Like what? Like a drug addict is like the guy you see on TV. I mean, I grew up in super rural Ohio, 1,800 people, small town. And I was like, drug addict? We didn't know what a drug addict was, except, like on a television show or in a movie. Like, you didn't know what that really meant. So it took me a really long time to comprehend what that meant and understand what was going on. And it took me years, to kind of work through that and figure that out. So I can tell, I would say that, yes, based on what my experience was, based on what it sounds like kind of your level of knowledge was also, let's hope that whatever we're doing today as either parents, friends, aunts, uncles, that we're changing that conversation and kind of leading back into this project. To answer that part of the question, I can remember, so I have 3 children, and my 2 boys are in they're teenagers, and my daughter is almost 12. And several weeks ago, we were like at the dinner table or something, and they said, "Why did you do this project?" Just because I think maybe the magazine had just come out or something, and they saw it and they were like, why did you do this project? And I said, here's the thing. We do some weird stuff in America. I go, the way that we approach healthcare is curious at best. Mm-hmm. And especially when it comes to something like mental health. Mm-hmm. I go, let me give you an example. If you twisted your ankle, you'd go see a doctor. If you, if you stubbed your toe, you'd go see your go see a doctor. If you got poked in the eye, you'd go see your doctor. But if something wasn't quite right in your brain, there's like, people don't know what to do. There's still such I think that there's such a feeling of shame and weakness and people being scared. And I'm sure there's probably a laundry list of other, feelings and emotions that people have, but we haven't made that conversation so normal that it's the same as twisting your ankle. And I think that's where we want to get. We want to be able to say, I twisted my ankle, I'm going to go see a doctor. Something's, I'm having dark thoughts, or I don't feel very well, or something else is going on, or I need to talk to somebody, I'm going to go see the doctor. Mm-hmm. And we need to be able, my real goal is to, the tagline is normalizing the conversation around mental health. And what I really want to show people is I think there's also people that feel very alone, right? They feel very vulnerable, and they feel like they're the only person who's feeling these feelings, and nobody else would understand. Yeah. So I want to try to get these stories out there, and I want to get as many different stories out there as I possibly can. And I want it to be people that people know. I want it to be people that maybe they can relate to, or people that they go to listen, play music, or people that they buy their art, or whatever, or maybe it's a poet. I mean, want to talk to all those people because I want people in those circles to say, it's not just me.
Yeah.
There are other people feeling the same thing. I'm not alone. It's, I know something's wrong. I need to go get help. And so did it. So maybe it's okay for me too.
Right.
And if we can just help one or two people, I think it'll be a huge thing. And if we can help more, even better.
That's so wonderful. So long-term vision in terms of, pardon me, the ongoing process. Are you going to look to continue to publish this in this same way, or do you have a sense of what the long-term vision looks like?
Yeah, so I don't know the answer. No Depression, we've not really had any conversations about moving forward with the project. I mean, the timeliness of this just happened to work perfectly for their wellness issue. I don't know if it makes sense for them, in the future, and I can appreciate that. So there's like two things. They're also a quarterly publication, so wouldn't be able to get those stories out quite as frequently as I probably would like to. So the intent today is, one, I'm so incredibly grateful to No Depression. I want to make sure that that's perfectly clear because they were the group that really, took this and said, okay, this makes sense. We're going to do this. And so I'm couldn't be happier that that's how that's played out. Mm-hmm. But for the future, I would like to find some type of ongoing, either publication or some medium for me to be able to continue to get that message out on a regular basis. And I have gone ahead and I've started posting it on my Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and I'm Cowtown Chad, like the farm animal cow. Mm-hmm. So Cowtown Chad. And I started putting that stuff on there this week. And I had permission from No Depression to reprint the Steve Poltz story. So that one's out there as well. And I have a lot of people who volunteered to keep this going. So I want to keep it going at a minimum on social media. So I want to make sure that those stories are at least getting out there that way. If there was a mental health group that had a substantial reach, I would be more than happy to talk to them. If it was a large publication that came out maybe on a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly basis, something like that, that would be a great fit as well. And maybe there's even a great online presence somewhere. That might be a good fit too. And I would just say that I'm open. I'm completely open to having conversations with multiple people. But I definitely want to keep the series going.
That's awesome, man. Yeah. And then whatever we can do, if it's something that on marinadepodcast.com that you want to publish, or some way I can get involved, if there's something that I can do with the podcast, I'm a big believer in this project, and that our forum is wide open to you, however we can help spread the word or however we can help be a part of this.
I really appreciate that. And I know that you are always have been incredibly kind on social media. And so if you continue to, you and anybody that listens to the podcast wants to share or retweet any of those stories, you can find me at that Cowtown Chad moniker on Facebook, as well as Instagram and Twitter, even on Tumblr, even though I don't use that very much, but I do have all of those out there. So any help would be appreciated.
That's awesome, man. And for the folks listening at home, the cowtownchad.com, on Chad's website, you can also get some of his gorgeous prints there as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
Dude, this has been so much fun. I so greatly appreciate your time and what you're working on.
I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for reaching out. And I hope we cross paths sometime soon.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to do this in person and talk about process even deeper next time. Well,
absolutely.
Thanks, Chad. Cheers, man.
All right. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too.
Bye.
I was born in winter, maybe it was fall. Heard this story many times, I don't remember it at all. Tonight the wind's sharp as a razor, and the sky looks like a I'm stranded in Los Feliz, trembling with the lithium blues.
Chad Cochran, y'all. Thank you so much, Chad, for your time and your openness. Let's do this again one day, sir. Thank you all for listening. If you like what you're hearing, give us a rating and a follow on your podcast app. Also, follow us on social media. I don't promise to be as good a follow as Cowtown Chad, but we do interact a lot with fans of the show, all of whom feel like friends at this point. Yeah, head on over to marinadepodcast.com for more Marinade, including my own photography, written pieces, and so much more, including those website exclusive episodes, 10 of which we've already published and several more which are on the way. If you really like what we're doing, consider joining our Patreon community. For just a few bucks a month, you can enjoy Patreon exclusive content like our show Jason's Journey, where I discuss the moments that have shaped my creative life, including behind the scenes looks at the Marinade and all the things that come with it. All right, y'all, it's time for What I'm Getting Down On, this segment of the show where I talk about the art that is inspiring me at the moment. Brian Koppelman, who, as you may know, is one of my greatest creative heroes, tweeted some podcast recommendations recently, one of which was the show Sound Opinions. I listened to the episode and the one that focused on the legendary Stax Records in Memphis. A few years ago, I took a group of 8th graders to Memphis. It's kind of a civil rights pilgrimage that we took, and one of the stops was Stax, and I fell deep down into the Stax rabbit hole thereafter. Well, I kind of got away from it for a little while, and this episode focuses on... I got away from it for a little while, and this episode of Sound Opinions focused on the MGs, Booker T and the MGs, and the Bar-Kays, the 2 session bands that back so many great Stax records. The most inspiring thing for me, even though this particular episode focused on bass, was listening to the guitar tones and just thinking about how they might make sense in my own music. It's interesting how I'll get hooked on a particular genre, and I try to listen to diverse... I try to diversify just about any art I'm consuming, but especially music, because I don't want to get locked into one idea. Both for my own edification and then also just for the influence that it has on the music that I create. And so it was cool to hear some of the guitar tones on those old Stax records. I'm not there yet. I'm not creating that kind of sound with my own work, but it's fun to kind of play around with it and think about it in that way. And it also just made me think about how much I love Memphis. If you haven't been there, make your way there. Just an incredible town. And with so much history, especially musically. Thank you all so much for listening. I'm so grateful for this conversation. Until next time, go out and create something. Cheers, y'all.